Good morning again, friends. Our reading today comes from the Gospel according to John. I'll be reading from the 6th chapter, verses 1 through 14. After this, Jesus went out to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs of what he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up to the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and he saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages wouldn't buy enough bread for each of these people to have a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up all the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who has come into the world." The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. For those of us who are joining us for the first time this month, we are in a new sermon series. It's called Teach Your Children Well. And we felt that this would be an appropriate sermon series as we were, in so many of our houses, gearing up toward a new school year. You know, the funny thing about the school year and the school calendar is that it doesn't seem to matter whether or not you yourself are a student anymore. Even when we get well into adulthood, it seems like so much of our lives is still dictated in part by the school calendar. The school calendar means that we're going to ramp up fall activities. It means that things get back into the swing of things. It means that we find those routines and patterns that had been abandoned at the beginning of the summer, and we pick them up again. And so if that describes your life, well, welcome back. It's happening. And for those of you who are preparing to go back to school, whether you are students or whether you are teachers or administrators, we wish you the best, and we'll be praying for you this school year and hope that you'll attend our prayer service that Andrew mentioned at the top of the service, coming up here a week from Tuesday night. But when we wanted to think about coming back to school and things starting back up again, we wanted to talk about what it means to teach children, what it means to instruct them. So last week we spent some time talking about teaching the next generation, whether that be somebody that we are parenting or whether we are grandparents to the next generations or great-grandparents even. Maybe you are a mentor, a neighbor, an aunt, an uncle, a teacher, a coach, somebody who has an impact and influence on the lives of those in the younger generations. What are you doing to teach them? What are you instilling in them? What kind of beliefs and values and teachings are you making sure that they understand in their lives because they have become so important to you in your life? How are you going to share that on with the next generation? But today we're going to flip the question a little bit. You see, you probably picked up on the fact that the sermon series called Teach Your Children Well is based on a song of the same title from Graham Nash of Crosby, Stills, and Nash back in the 1960s. And you heard a little bit of that song just a moment ago on the video lead-in to this sermon. But what you may not have realized if you haven't heard the song for a while is that in the second verse of the song, it doesn't say teach your children well, it says teach your parents well. So we're kind of flipping the script here a little bit. And today I want to talk a little bit about what it is that we can learn from children, specifically adults. And know, those kids who are tuning into the worship service this morning and following along at home, be thinking about other things that you learned from your peers or things that are good lessons that you might wish to teach to your parents. And so we actually asked a handful of kids this week from this congregation what it is that they would like to teach to their parents. And I posed this question to them. As a kid, as a child, as a teenager, wherever you are, as a child, what message or teaching would you like to tell to your grown-ups in your life? And here's what they said. Check it out.
As a child, what is something that you would want adults to know?
That I will always love you. I don't like taking naps. Be a super dad.
I've heard other kids complain about parents saying well, when I was younger, and then just being well, this is now. It's not that time. That, and maybe we want to know why when someone says no to something, not just because.
If you wanted to tell a grown-up something, or tell mommy or daddy something, what would you want to tell them?
I'm ready to play.
You're ready to play?
Uh-huh.
Anything else?
Yes.
What?
To go for a walk.
Adults say kids have too much screen time, but really adults have more than kids.
All right, so you heard quite a spectrum there, and maybe depending on the age of the child, having a little bit of kind of different advice for us. Some of them just want us to know that they are ready to play or to take a walk, or that they are loved, that they are a good parent. Others have suggested things that as the kids have gotten a little bit older, maybe some things that, we're guilty of doing in many cases, us adults. Yeah, I, for one, know, for example, that I have said, because I said so, that's why, without giving much further explanation. And I am guilty at times of not putting down my phone or my screens. So I know that some of this advice comes as practical advice to many of us, and those words ring true in our own households. But what I want to do today as well is look at children in Scripture, and particularly this particular passage that you heard just a moment ago as I read to you from the book of John. And in John's gospel, we hear this story that we know in the other gospels, it makes it into those gospels as well. But in this story of the feeding of the 5,000, the story is told a little bit different. In this story, the gospel writer shares that Jesus is offering this question to his disciples about where it is and how it is that they are going to feed these many people who have gathered on the hillside. You see, we don't know a whole lot about what's going on here, except for that Jesus has been teaching, he's attracted a crowd of people, and the group has begun to swell with more and more people over time. So there is quite a large gathering of people. We hear later on that it's actually around 5,000 who have gathered that day, and they are there on the hillside, ready to listen to Jesus teach them more, and they're hanging on his every word. So much so that the day is quickly passing by, and it's a meal time. And that if the people are going to stay there and continue to be fed on Jesus' word, they're going to need to be fed in gut as well. So Jesus says, well, how are we going to feed these people? And the first response that he gets is one that, look, we don't have anywhere near the money that it would cost to feed all of these people. So that's not going to work. But the gospel writer lets us in on a little joke. He says that Jesus is asking this question to test his disciples and to see what their response is going to be. So then another disciple comes forward and he says, hey, there's this boy, and he's got 5 loaves of barley bread, and he's got 3 fish, but that's not really going to make much of a dent in this crowd, so there's that, but what are we going to do with it? And Jesus says, bring it here. Now, the interesting thing here, of course, is that what Jesus ends up doing is performing one of his miracles. Everybody that day on the hillside gets fed, 5,000 of them. So much is this a miraculous event that there is leftovers afterwards. Extra bread, 12 baskets full of bread for the people to continue to have in excess. It's an example of God's abundance in this situation. And yet, one of the things that I find so compelling about this story, or so fascinating, is that Jesus chooses to lift up this boy is what an example of faith looks like. Now, he doesn't spell it out quite like that, but Jesus takes the gift of a child and says, this is going to be sufficient. Now, all of the adults in the story look at this meager offering of 5 barley loaves and 3 fish, which, by the way, is a good bit for a family, but it's not going to feed 5,000. And so right away, the naysayers of the group say, this isn't going to work. This isn't enough. Why even bother? And it occurs to me that many of us have fallen into that same trap time and time again. For example, have you ever felt that there was a good idea or a vision maybe that God has placed on your heart, and you were quickly the one to discount this vision because you didn't recognize how it could be done practically or easily, or you just couldn't imagine how it would play out? I'll be the first to admit that in the church I have felt that way before. We'll have an idea in a group or in a committee. How about if we put on this kind of event and it'll be so great and we could do all of this? But then quickly people around the table, including myself, have said, yeah, but it's going to take so many people and I'm not sure that that's a good date and where will we come up with the money for this? And immediately we start to find ways to think of the original proposal as one that is unfeasible. Or we look at this child with the loaves and fishes and we say, that's pretty naive to think that anything could actually become of that. And so we become our own stumbling blocks, we become our own naysayers, we become our own worst enemies in a situation like this because we begin to think of reasons why it won't work. And that's exactly where the disciples go in this story. Hey, we're never going to come up with the resources to feed these people, not in a moment's notice. Hey, this kid's got some food, but so what? I mean, that'll feed a handful of people, and then what? How are we going to do that? Are we going to line people up based on who's the most hungry? It's going to be a disaster. And rather than looking at the situation and saying, what is God going to do with this? How is Jesus going to make something happen in this situation? We immediately discount the possibility that anything like that could ever take place. And instead, this story would seem to point to the small child and to say, maybe we should see the world more like he does when he comes to Jesus with his offering and believes that something can actually be done from that. It reminds me of the child who breaks open the piggy bank and comes in with $10.44 and believes that that's going to change the world if she puts that in the offering plate. But the truth of the matter is that we don't know what God is going to do with that. And we never know what God is going to do with our gifts, with our offering, with our resources, with our lives. Sometimes the most miraculous things that have ever happened in humanity started because somebody started with a small gesture. And combined with God's mighty power, something incredible happened because of that. So that's the first lesson of 2 lessons I want you to remember today. How is it that as we might see the world as a child does and not become our own barriers, how might we believe that God is actually up to something powerful in our midst? Maybe what we have to offer, whether it's some loaves and fishes, whether it's our time, whether it's offering a prayer, we never know what God is going to do. And maybe we should see the world like this child does in the story and believe that God is up to something magnificent and maybe even miraculous. Now, the other lesson that I want you to think about is something else that we can learn from children. So, in addition to asking some of the kids what they would like to teach adults, I also interviewed a few of our teachers this week, educators within our congregation. I spoke to them over the phone, contacted them on email, and got some interesting feedback. I asked them a question that was similar to the one I asked the kids. I said, tell me of a time that a child made a huge impact on your life. Somebody that you were teaching in the classroom. What happened? Tell me the story behind that, or tell me how it changed your perspective on something, or gave you a new appreciation, or maybe it caused you to teach in a different way. And some of the responses I got were the following. One teacher said, it never ceases to amaze me how much children grasp technology, new technology in particular, and they are able to teach us. This teacher said, some of the greatest technological learnings I've had have come from my students who have continued to inspire me and teach me all the things that they can do so effortlessly, but it's taken me some time to learn. I know that that's true for me, and I'm guessing it's true for you too. I have learned from my children in terms of technology, and I have taught the generation older than me about technology as well. And I know, again, that sounds like a familiar refrain for many of you. Other teachers said things like, another one told me a story about how there was a new student coming into the school that year, and this boy's father died right before the school year started. And so some school administrators asked the teachers who would be instructing that child that year to go to this boy's father's funeral before the school year even started. The teacher went on to say that it was something that really made a connection between she and that boy. And that boy not only starting a new school year, but starting the new school year at a brand new school, grieving the death of a parent. She empathized with him. She sought to reach out to him and connect with him. And they formed a strong bond there between teacher and student, one of those special ones that teachers and students crave. And now, years later, even more than a decade later, that boy is now a young man in his 20s. And this teacher and this student continue to have a relationship where they stay in contact, a part of each other's lives, a strong bond that isn't going away. Another story I heard was about students that oftentimes get labeled, the problem students, the behavior issue students that get a reputation at some point in school, and it seems to carry on with them from grade after grade. Maybe it gets stories get shared in the teacher's lounge, or maybe it's just this student makes a name for themselves in the hallways. But it's the student that the teachers, when they see that student's name on the roster in the fall, they cringe thinking about what will this year hold because I have that problem child in my class. But this teacher said this time she was going to do it differently, and she was going to try to connect with that child, to try to know more about what was going on in his life. Maybe there was a reason that he was acting out like he was. Maybe there was a reason that he was struggling academically, and she wanted to know more about that. So she made it her particular mission that year to try to connect with him, to know as much as she could. And she began to tutor him and help him, and she saw his confidence begin to grow as he understood the subject matter. And so one day she decided to place a phone call to the child's mother just to compliment him to his mother about the progress that he had made that year. And she said, as the mother answered the phone and I explained who I was, she said, there was silence on the other end of the line, as though she was just bracing for more bad news about how her child had done something terrible at school that day. And she said that when she explained that she wanted to just compliment him on his hard work and on his positive attitude and how he's making such progress, that the mother burst into tears and said, I have never received any calls from school other than negative ones. And what a difference that made. It's almost predictable then what happens with the rest of the story. The child continues to grow and thrive because he's believing in himself, no longer as the clown, no longer as the behavior issue, no longer seeing himself as the problem child, but one who can succeed at school, one who the teacher likes, one who could actually make friends with his peers. Another story, another one that stood out to me, is one of an occupational therapist within our church who works in a couple of different school systems. She told the story about how one of the lessons that she has learned from kids, especially working with kids with special needs, is that sometimes you have to go in and meet the kids exactly where they are and not just come in with a preconceived idea of how this lesson is going to go. She said that she had planned this exciting lesson she was very excited about insects and bats and bugs. And she said, but when she got there, she realized that this boy with autism wasn't going to learn anything as long as he was still fixated that day on his toy trains that he was holding in his hands. And so instead of using the lesson that she had prepared, she started to build one based around the trains. And she said, I got out an ink pad, a stamp pad, and we rolled the train through the ink, and then we rolled it on the page, and he was able in time to be able to write his name with the ink from the train's wheels. And then we made the lines on the page, and then we were able to use that as lines to write within with a pencil. She said, it changed how I teach. It gave me a new appreciation for meeting kids where they're at. As I've thought about these stories and listened to them on the videos and reread them over and over again, thought about my notes from talking to some of these teachers, something interesting stands out to me. And that is that what the kids said as far as their advice for parents and what the teachers said as their learnings from children are not that far apart. In fact, in many cases, they're actually saying the same thing. Make sure that you meet the children where they are, not coming in necessarily with all of your grand ideas, but meeting them where they are. That sounds a lot like, I just want you to play with me. I just want you to take a walk with me. Giving a child attention who maybe isn't getting the attention that they've needed in the classroom sounds a lot like, I'd like my parents to set down their phones or their computers and give me the time and the attention that I'm looking for at home. Maybe it's the student who says, you're a super daddy and I want you to know that I'll love you always. That sounds a lot like the message that we all so desperately want to hear. It occurs to me that these messages from children sound a lot like Jesus' messages to us. The messages that adults can tell us about meeting kids where they are sound a lot like what God was trying to do through Jesus in our lives and in the world. You see, God didn't just create humanity and then step back. Throughout the Old Testament, throughout the Hebrew Bible stories, we hear stories about the prophets and the judges and the others who came to try to set humanity straight again, to try to teach, to try to offer an example, to try to draw that connection between our God and the people closer and closer together. And then God sent His only Son, Jesus Christ, into the world in an attempt to show us what it means to connect with God. I love you so much, I want somebody who is going to meet you where you are. I want to give the attention that you need. I want to speak to you at your level. I want to create a life out of you, and I want to show you how to do it. It seems to me that all of these pieces of advice from children, from teachers, from Scripture seem to be intersecting at this point. Isn't that what we all want? Isn't that what we all want, is to be loved, to be known, to be met exactly where we are, and to be loved through our hardships, celebrated during our times of joy? That's what a relationship with Jesus Christ does. That's something that we all hunger for. That's something that we find fulfillment in Jesus Christ. Whether it's the boy who looks at the world in a way that we would say is naive, or whether it's in the message of a 3-year-old saying, I just want to play, or a teacher saying, meet them where they are. We're talking about the kind of lessons that are timeless for humanity. They're for parents, they're for grandparents, they're for teachers, they're for mentors, they're for every one of us. As we claim the name of Christian, and as we seek to live into what it means to be a child of God. Now, some of you have thoroughly explored this relationship, and you know what that means. And you have found a peace in your life, while others of you may be listening to this and saying, I still have questions. I want to know more, but that sure sounds good. That is something that I've been hungering for. And we invite you to enter into a conversation with other believers. Seek out a trusted friend, and I would certainly welcome to have that conversation with you, as I know so many people on this wonderful staff would be eager to do as well. We want to have that conversation. We want to invite you in. We want to welcome you into this family of faith, because there is a peace that we find in being known and being met where we are and being given the love and the grace that we also desperately crave.